Hello. You are listening to the podcast A Badge Well Worn by James Mitchell. We will be discussing actual cases investigated and hear from investigators and prosecutors involved in those cases. Our goal is to captivate you and allow you to see real criminal investigations and court cases through the eyes of the people involved. These stories should keep you on the edge of your seat. Recording. I'm speaking with Tom Vanes. Tom is a former prosecuting attorney in Northwest Indiana. He had over 48 years of experience as an attorney. He's received his undergraduate degree from Notre Dame University and his Doctor of Jurisprudence from Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana. Tom served as a deputy prosecutor in Lake County, Indiana for 13 years, specializing in murder prosecutions and cases involving career criminals. In 1989, he jumped over on the dark side and joined the Lake County Public Defender's Office for both trial and appellate. Those are my words, by the way, Tom's. He is now the first assistant for that office. In other words, he runs the program. Tom has maintained a private practice in Maryville, Indiana for close to 30 years with a focus on state and federal criminal defense. He was a city judge from 2000 to 2012, and he has been involved in 24 death penalty cases, more than any other lawyer in northern Indiana, by the way. In September of 22, Tom was presented with the Uncuff the Innocent Award by Purdue Northwest University for his decade-long pro bono work to exonerate inmate Willie Donald and cleared him of murder charges after 24 years in prison. Quite an accomplishment. Tom, welcome to our podcast. Did I cover everything adequately?
You and I go way back, so it's good to talk to you.
Thanks. Today I wanted to talk to you about a case that you handled, and I mentioned in my book, which you're graciously showing on your end of the camera. I wanted to get a little point of view from you on that case. The defendant's name was Lester Bergner. Do you recall that case, Tom?
I sure do. It was one of the earlier ones you and I made caselaw in Indiana on the thing. It was the case with a novel twist. And I remember you first tried to get it filed through the prosecutor's office at the time, and it took you out, correct?
Right. I'll lay you a little bit of a foundation for this thing, how it came to me. Then you can pick it up after I brought it over to you. I was approached at the police department by a couple. Came in. It was a walk-in, and the lady and her husband, her second husband, had found a photograph album in what used to be the office of her ex-husband. And in this photograph album, there was a photograph of a child with a male penis in her mouth. The child appeared to be about 3 to 5 years old, somewhere in that range, and appeared to be in a bed, and her eyes were closed and looked like she might have been sleeping. In any case, it was kind of a revolting kind of a photograph, and the mother clearly was upset and wanted something done. The problem that I saw initially was an identification issue. The little girl was not a problem, but the male in the picture was going to be a problem. Anyway, I'm going to let you get into that a little bit because that kind of unfolded in court after this case was filed. When I brought it into court, by the way, I took it in, and of course, I really knew I had an uphill battle to get this filed because in Indiana, you have to establish a foundation for photographs, and that foundation usually consists of the person that took the picture has to say that the photograph accurately depicts what it's supposed to represent. And in this case, the photographer was a defendant, and so we're not going to get a foundation from him. So we had to find a way around that. And And that's where this thing gets interesting. So you want to pick it up from there, Tom?
Yeah, the obstacle to prosecution here was not factual. If I remember right, the picture was clear as a bell. It depicted a crime. There was no ambiguity to it. The little girl was performing a sex act on this adult male. As you mentioned, there was a little bit of circumstantial evidence required to identify who the male was, but you had that covered. The obstacle toward prosecution here was legal, not factual. Indiana law at the time was the obstacle to going forward with this case. You just can't throw a picture into a courtroom and expect it to be admitted as evidence. The judge, who acts as gatekeeper of evidence, is going to require that there be some sort of witness, whether it's the photographer himself or some other witness, to verify that the photograph was accurate, because the witness has seen what's in the photograph with his or her own eyes and can say, therefore, this picture is genuine. You didn't have that. The little girl, I think she was 4 at the time, was too young to be a witness in court, and she didn't recall the event in any case. As you mentioned, it looked like she'd been woken up for this particular picture. So, the man wasn't talking. The suspect, of course, was the woman's ex-husband, Mr. Bergman, and he wasn't going to admit or acknowledge that he took that particular photograph. So, in the absence of a witness, the case was going nowhere. I kind of understood why you first got rejected when you tried to get this filed.
Yeah, it's and by the way, kudos to you for jumping in and dipping me out of the grease on this, because I had no place to go after getting the case declined, and I totally understood why they were declining the case, and I understand the case law and the rules of evidence involving photography, but I was and still am appreciative of the fact that you elected, in the face of all those adversarial issues, to jump in and try to push this through in any case. Can you tell me, we got into the trial, can you tell me a little bit about how you got that evidence in, and the judge, and some of the motions that were filed to protect the defendant?
Yeah, let me back up just a second. One of my defects is that the personal level is I'm easily bored. Means I'm always on the lookout professionally for something new, something novel, something with a twist, which is how you introduced me back in those days. It seemed to me there's something wrong here when you had a clear crime being committed and no clear way to prosecute. So if the obstacle was going to be the law, then it was time for you and I to change the law, which is kind of what we set out to do. If memory serves, you sent the photographs. There were 2 Polaroids, and you sent them off to the FBI lab in D.C. An analyst there, a crack photographic examiner by the name of Vanes was the name. Am I right?
That's correct. Yeah, I remember him.
Yeah. He took a look at the pictures and sent back a report saying, in his professional opinion, there was nothing fake about them. They were genuine. They were authentic. They had not been retouched or altered. In today's language, he would say they had not been photoshopped in any form or fashion, although there was no Photoshop in those days. But he put a stamp of approval on the 2 Polaroids as being authentic. So off we went to court. The main obstacle was going to be convincing the judge. A few states out there, Indiana not included, had developed some case law that said if you don't have a witness, then you can substitute technical testimony in place of the witness to authenticate a photograph. Called it the silent witness theory. And the theory was that if you had technical expertise that could show that the process of taking the photographs produced a genuine, unaltered image, then you could use that as a basis for admitting the photograph as evidence. Now, Indiana had not yet adopted that silent witness theory. It had not rejected it. It just simply not faced the issue one way or the other. A few states had, California in particular, I remember finding some research. A few states had rejected it. So the question was going to be, could we get the judge to accept this new theory? Because if a photograph is admitted under the silent witness theory, then it speaks for itself, so to speak. It becomes its own kind of witness as to what happened. So we had a pretrial hearing. I remember extensive arguments. I remember extensive briefs. And the initial reaction from the trial judge, it was a good man named Jim Clement. He's now dead. He was skeptical. You know, I could see the skepticism in deciding whether to admit this photograph as evidence. And he was skeptical until he saw it. And when he actually took a look at what he saw, you could almost see the change come over his face like a wave. And from that point on, he was on our side. He agreed that the evidence could come in, assuming Barry Moniz testified in front of the jury. And in some ways, I guess our prosecution was downhill from that point on. Downhill in the sense of we were prevailing.
I'm going to jump back in here for a sec. One of the things that, from my point of view, during the course of the trial was we tried to get the jury to just see the victim so that they could get an idea, connect it with the photograph, and help on the ID part that it was her. And obviously in Indiana, a child under a certain age is not a credible witness in court. Can you tell us a little bit about the judge allowing or not allowing the victim to show up in court?
Yeah, I think you were right. We believed it was a legitimate. It was legitimate on our part to try to show or display the little girl to the jury because she was in the picture. They had a right to see and verify that the person we claimed was in the picture was in fact this identified little girl. The judge saw it differently. His thinking was that the defense was not really contesting who the little girl was in the photograph. Therefore, showing her to the jury had no real relevance and might engender too much sympathy for her and for the prosecution. So he prohibited me from using her as, in fact, an exhibit and displaying her to the jury or even being in the courtroom. So she was effectively vanished in the hallways. Now, her mom was, of course, an essential witness. She's the one who found the photographs. Mom was curious and wanted to stay in the courtroom to see the case as it unfolded. But what do you do with the little girl? She was only 4 years old at the time. Somebody had to watch her, and that became you, if I remember. You were caretaker during the trial for the most part, which led to this whole painful moment where you and her and the jurors kind of bumped into each other, or at least asked each other out in the hallways and in the courtroom, if I recall. At least that's what I learned after the fact. Is that true?
Yeah, I think that's a brief but adequate description of what happened. I mean, little kids, 4 or 5-year-old kids are pretty fidgety, and this little girl, she wasn't going to sit on a bench and take that sitting down, so to speak, but she wanted to go for a walk. So we walked the halls for a while, and next thing you know, I've got these 14 people walking by me with little jury tags on their clothing, saying we're a juror, don't talk to them. They all kind of smiled and looked at this little girl, and she waved at them and she smiled back at them, and they looked at me, and they had seen me in the courtroom, and so I knew I was a police officer investigating this case and helping you out with the trial. So I, I suppose they must have made a connection there. What do you think?
Stuff like that happens in trials. Jurors, they're not beamed into a courtroom or transported like Star Trek, and they walk the hallways just like witnesses, and civilians, and lawyers, and the public do. So things like that happen. It certainly didn't disrupt the trial.
So what happened? What happened? What was the result of the trial?
The jury didn't have a whole lot of trouble convicting Mr. Bergner. He ended up being sentenced off to prison on the thing. The second battle, and we had the battle getting the trial judge to agree to let the photographs in as evidence. And we won that battle, of course, but that had precedent only for proceedings in that particular courtroom. There was going to be an appeal, and then the question was, is this new Indiana theory about a silent witness, is it going to have statewide precedent because the Court of Appeals in Indianapolis is going to put a stamp of approval on it? I wasn't involved in the lawyering in that. A good lawyer from the Attorney General's office in Indianapolis took care of that portion. And we won at that level too, although it was closer than I anticipated. It was a 2-to-1 split in favor of the prosecution, and the silent witness theory then got the stamp of approval for statewide use. Decades since, I think it's been cited as precedent hundreds of times, not just in Indiana, but elsewhere in other states across the country.
That was amazing. That's a little factoid that I didn't know. And I also didn't know the judge had been swayed by the photograph, although it does surprise me because it swayed us too. But it was just such a shocking picture.
Yeah.
Going back, go ahead.
Saying that if it looks genuine to the eye, it probably should be admitted as evidence. But the law always doesn't track common sense. So it was important to get that recognized as a legal principle. Now, to this day, I will get occasional sarcastic thank yous from my defense colleagues who get bit in the backside when that principle is used against them in defending somebody, but it's all kind of good natured.
Speaking of good natured, the defendant offered kind of a unusual defense for himself. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. He called his current wife to the stand. As you mentioned earlier, the ex-wife is the one who brought the photographs to your attention. At the time of the trial, he had remarried, and his current wife was a witness who said, "That's not him in the photographs." And I know it's not him in the photographs. Again, he was visible only between the knee and the chest. She said, "That's not him because he's not that big." She was not talking about his overall body size. She was talking about one particular aspect of his body, and if you catch my drift.
Yeah.
I remember thinking at the time, well, this is going to get tacky because, of course, I couldn't let that claim go unchallenged. I had to cross-examine the woman. And how do you do so without it becoming tacky? And the answer to that was, of course, you can't. So it was a tacky cross-examination, but the jury didn't have much trouble rejecting her claim. I know that particular defense, though, prompted quite a bit of ribald and graphic humor between you and I after the fact.
Yeah, that's the gallows humor. Not to take anything away from this awful crime and the poor victim involved. Sympathies go out, but sometimes we see the most ridiculous, outrageous things, and you just try to rationalize it. But yeah, I know there was even discussion of having a penis lineup at one point. That didn't sound like something that Judge Clement would go for.
Not a bit. Speaking of poor victim, Mitch, there's a real twist with this case involving California. You got a call from the authorities out there a couple of years after the trial, not long at all.
Yeah.
And they were a little background here. The ex-wife who had brought the pictures to your attention, the mother of the little girl, she'd remarried. And she remarried a man named Robert Diaz, if I have it correctly. Do I have?
I believe that's it. Yeah.
And then he moved out to California. And a few years after the trial, you got a call from the California authorities. They were looking at Diaz. He was a nurse, as one of those so-called angels of death, the caregivers who take life instead of save lives. He was a nurse who was giving lidocaine and killing patients. And what were the numbers? He was suspected of killing dozens of patients under his care, was he not?
33 elderly patients that were in critical care unit where he worked midnight shift. Yeah, they sent out the prosecutor and one of his lead investigators came to visit our jurisdiction. They wanted to talk to some of the hospitals where Diaz had been employed as a nurse when he lived back in Indiana. And the prosecutor's office wanted me to kind of help them with the move around in the jurisdiction and see if we couldn't help them out. But apparently, most of the victims in California that had passed were cremated. I think there was about 7 or 8 that they were able to exhume, and they found those traces of lidocaine in their system, in their liver, and they were able
He
to.
ended up,
Go ahead.
didn't he? Yeah, he ends up on death row and died there maybe 10, 12, 15 years ago, something like that. I always thought, what a star-crossed little girl that was. Her natural father, molester. Her stepfather is a serial killer. And one hopes that later life, something good happened to her to compensate her for what she went through as a child. I mean, it's quite an upbringing.
It also doesn't speak too highly of the mother's ability to pick a good mate. She's struck out twice pretty badly. Tom, I appreciate you sharing your experience in this trial. We had a lot of cases we worked together. We're going to be following up on several of those cases. And is there anything else you'd like to add to what we talked about today in the last few minutes?
Yeah, one last postscript, Mitch. Bergner himself died here in recent years. I never heard anything more about him or from him in the intervening years. Whether he got in any more trouble or not, I didn't hear. I don't think he did, frankly. Maybe somebody else knows better. But the case itself lived on much longer than most of the ones we handled. Mm-hmm. I'm glad you brought it to me. I'm glad we both took a chance. It certainly worked out well.
Tom, thanks a lot. I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up, and we'll be talking again in about a week to do another podcast.
Appreciate it.
See you. I hope you found this episode of A Badge Well Worn informative. We will be producing weekly new episodes featuring interesting stories as told by the people involved in the case. We look forward to sharing our experiences with you. We appreciate the sacrifices made by our protectors, the police. I hope you are inspired to get a copy of my book, A Badge Well Worn, available on Amazon. Don't forget to reach out to me at our website, jem-books.com.